Introduce our keynote speaker, Emilie Mazzacurati. Based in New York, Moody's is known to many of you as the global leader in research and ratings assigned to bonds issued by commercial and governmental organizations. Emilie is the global head of Moody's Climate Solutions Division. Emilie is the founder and CEO of 427, which is based in Berkeley, California, is now a Moody's affiliate. She oversees the Climate Solutions Suite within Moody's ESG Solutions Group, a new business unit formed to serve the growing global demand for environmental, social, and corporate governance and climate analytics. Moody's Climate Solutions provides climate risk screening for listed securities and real assets to help financial institutions, corporations, governmental entities, and make sure they understand their exposure to the impacts of climate change, prepare for the transition to a zero carbon economy, and build resilience. Emilie is a frequent public speaker and teaches at UC Davis's Executive MBA program. Previously, she was head of research at Thomson Reuters Point Carbon, where she directed research and modeling on carbon pricing. She also served as a policy advisor to the mayor of Paris on environmental policy. Emilie holds a Master's of Political Science from the Paris Institute of Political Studies and a Master's of Public Policy from UC Berkeley. Emilie will have some introductory remarks for us, which will last about 10 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of our time on Q&A. So feel free to send in questions as Emilie's speaking, and we'll be getting to the Q&A portion here relatively quickly. So with that, I'd now love to hand it over to Emilie Mazzacurati.
Thank you so much, Steve, for this very thorough introduction, and very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. As Steve mentioned, I'll start with a little bit of prepared remark, and then looking forward to a more free-flowing Q&A and presentation. I'm gonna try to get my slides in the right place. Let's see. All right, so you should see my slide, and I'll go straight into the meat of things. So first, I wanted to take a step back and make sure that we were all on the same page when we talk about climate risk. There are generally two main ways that climate change manifests as an economic and financial risk: physical risk and transition risk. Physical risk includes what you would expect: flooding, drought, sea level rise, heat stress, all of which can in turn affect both production, operations, but also supply chain, assets, markets, and just the ability of commodities, goods, and services that are required to run a business. Transition risk refers to the changes that will be needed to our economy, technology, our regulatory systems to transition to a world with low or no carbon. That means moving away from fossil fuel. We are talking about a world where we might not be using oil and gas anymore. We might not be using certainly coal. California is well on its way for that. And there are extensive implications when you think about how corporations may be affected. We're not going to build cars the same way. We're not going to build highways and trains the same way. We're not going to be generating energy. So there's a range of potential implications for corporations and for other players and actors in the economic system. For today, I'll focus on physical risk, but of course, happy to discuss transition risk as well in the Q&A segment. So how does climate hazards affect business, and how material is this, right? This can be a question. I think in California, it's less of a question because we've all experienced one way or another some of the natural disasters that have hit the state in recent years. Thinking of wildfires, of course, thinking of floods. But I have a few examples here that go beyond the sort of the expected or what we've seen most recently in human memory. If you think of Hurricane Harvey, where a chemical storage facility was flooded, which led to a fire, which led to environmental spill into the environment, the effects can sort of ripple well beyond the initial hazard. Similarly, my second picture on the bottom, here we're looking at a health facility in Florida, which lost power after Hurricane Irma a few years ago. Because it lost power and it was so hot, some of the residents actually passed because of the heat. And that is not a good outcome for anybody, but including from a business standpoint, right? And then another example, looking at my little water bottles here on the bottom right, if you think of the drought that has hit California in recent years, and unfortunately it looks like we're headed for another period of drought with the dry winter that we've had. What does that mean for beverage companies in California that are in the business of bottling water that may be needed for other uses locally, right? So all of this can be very real. What we saw in California a few years back is that the regulation was changed to regulate how groundwater was used. That had implications for the beverage companies that were used to drawing in this water, right? So there's a range, a sort of a web of impact, starting from the primary hazard that hits, and then trickling down, rippling away in terms of impacts on regulatory, economic, environment, and business chains at large. So let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing in California. The state of California has been investing heavily and consistently into better understanding the risk, and is funding some of the most advanced science on climate that we see in the country and in the world. So the most recent climate assessment, which was released about 2 years ago now, shows that we're expecting temperature increase, average temperature increase of 5.6 to 8.8 degrees, which is a lot to deal with if you think of the impact. And of course, we're all experiencing regular heat waves, even the weather we have today, not quite seasonal, but also impacts in terms of the water supply projected to decline by 2/3, in terms of wildfires, with increased area burned by 77%, and sadly that's happening faster than anyone would like. About almost $18 billion worth of residential and commercial real estate that could be inundated statewide by sea level rise in 2050. As the former California official used to say, we have it all in California. We have all the climate hazards. And so it's important to understand what those means. And thankfully, we do have a good handle on what those impacts are. I want to talk a little more about what that means for the economy and the environment in which we operate, looking a little bit at infrastructure. Here, what you're seeing to the left is a map of pipelines in the Bay Area. What does that mean when there's floods, there's a storm, sea level rise? What you're going to see is some of those pipelines might find themselves underwater. Turns out pipelines are not meant to be underwater. That's really bad. And so if you look at the details, you see that the most critical energy supply network in the entire region would be affected by sea level rise and by chronic or catastrophic floods, including the ability for gas stations to have gas, ability for the airport to have jet fuel, ability to access natural gas. The impacts are really quite large when you start looking. The middle map here shows the exposure of electric transmission lines to wildfires. And as we've learned and seen in the past 2 years, beyond the regions where the lines themselves might be exposed, there are impacts on the grid well downstream because of now the effort to be more, have more of a preventative approach and preemptively shut down the network to avoid starting new wildfires. So we are already seeing economic impacts from the wildfires themselves, as well as the prevention efforts through impacts on the grid in particular. And then maybe a little more anecdotally, but when it gets too hot, some things just don't function, right? So here I have a screenshot from an article when it was so hot in Phoenix that airplanes couldn't fly. The physics of getting an airplane off the ground requires a certain temperature range. And if it gets too hot, the airplane will not lift. We're seeing some of those same impacts if you think of of impact on the electricity grid, which becomes less efficient and just stops functioning just at the time when we need it most, when it gets very hot. So there's, again, a connected web of impacts that are vulnerable to different type of hazards and then can affect each other and all of us through this critical infrastructure, even if we're not directly affected by a single event or manifestation. Another really important impact for the state is the impact on agriculture and tourism. And what's important to understand with climate is we're not entirely sure what the impacts will be on precipitation. We know it's going to get hotter. We have really good data on how hot it's going to be. Precipitation is much harder to predict. There are more complex influences, including seasonal and interseasonal impacts, including La Nina, La Nina. And so we're not exactly sure when we look at the future for California, whether it's going to get dry, very dry, or maybe it's going to get wetter. But what we know is that we're going to see disruption not only in the amount of rain that falls, but also when it falls and how it falls. So right now, the state relies heavily on having precipitation at certain time of the year in certain region, where it turns into snowpack, and it is stored as snowpack well into the summer and provides water to the state through the dry season. What we're seeing here is that the rain might be earlier or later, and because of warmer temperature, not be stored as snowpack. And so instead it flows. It may create floods because it falls in more intense, shorter event, or it might just not create that availability through the snowpack that we've come to rely on, because that used to be the characteristics of the California climate. When you think of changes to the snowpack, of course, you have to think of impacts on the tourism economy in the Sierra, and the fact that ski resorts are being challenged to adjust to winters with very little snow, and then impacts on every single crop, which is very sensitive to even small changes in temperature and in precipitation patterns. The wine industry, of course, comes to mind, and many local wineries are well aware already of the impact of water stress, of temperature changes on their ability to grow their wines, not to mention the catastrophic impacts of wildfires when those happen in the wine regions. Here you have a map showing how entire regions and suitability is going to shift over time, and we're going to see Washington State and Quebec. We're going to see England and Northern Europe become suitable for wine, and regions that were traditionally producing wine may not be suitable in the future. And I live in California, but I'm French, and nothing pains me more than the thought of English wine. I'll be honest with you. So the impacts again are wide-reaching. I don't want to leave you on just a dreadful and depressing note. So I want to talk a little bit about what you can do, what businesses can do. And while we live in a state that has exposure to a lot of climate hazards, we're also lucky enough to live in a state in California where there's a lot of resources and support for adaptation and resilience. So what I've put on the slide here is extracted from a website called resilientbusiness.org, which is a Sacramento-based initiative to support business resiliency that contains a lot of practical steps that you can do to understand your risk, to assess your own readiness, take action, update your plan, and engage with community resiliency efforts. And that's important because there are things that each of us can do individually as individuals, as business owners, but we all depend on collective resiliency. We depend on investments from local communities and from the state in adaptation, and the state and local communities depend on each of us being engaged and supportive of those efforts. I've put a few other resources here, largely run by the state, that provide links to better understand the impact, as well as additional resources on business resiliency beyond the capital region to help support the work. So I'll leave it at that for my prepared remark and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Emilie, for that provocative introduction. And I have to say, as somebody who was born in London and spent many years in England, that I'm excited about the prospect of English wine and disappointed that you see it differently, but not surprising coming from a Parisian. With that said, we've got a bunch of questions here. Let's start at the federal level. The Biden administration has stated, many times that one of their top priorities will be addressing climate change. How do you think that this is going to manifest in terms of new regulations and investment opportunities?
That is a very big question. There is a lot going on. So I'll try to touch on some of the headlines that's happening. So I think most visible, although maybe less concrete for some of us in the field, is the fact that the US has now joined again the Paris Agreement, which is the global agreement between all the countries in the world to reduce carbon emissions and to try to stave off climate change. And you need this kind of global agreement because it's a global problem. If only a country or even just California reduces its emissions, it's not going to do it, right? We need everybody to be on board. So having the US, one of the largest emitters in the world, re-engage meaningfully and be part of those conversations means a lot in and of itself, and also because it puts pressure on others to do more. So that's one piece. There's investment in clean tech and in green growth, which is a very big priority for the administration. Just today, Department of Energy announced $40 billion worth of loans for clean energy being made available. The fund is run by a well-known clean energy investor called Jigar Shah. So there's going to be a lot happening there. We're seeing regulation to reduce greenhouse gases, and I hope an effort to direct some of the pandemic recovery investments towards helping us move away from fossil fuel. The question is, what will the administration be able to do? We know it has a very razor-thin majority in Congress, and while there is much more support from the business community to take action on climate change than there was 10 years ago, last time someone tried, it's still a very politicized environment, and there's only so much that will happen in Congress. So a lot of it will be executive action. And then last thing I'll flag is that we're seeing the financial regulators mobilizing on the topic of climate.
Thank you. And we have a question here kind of following up on your comment about rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. What's the impact of that on the state of California, and what is the state doing to prepare for climate change?
So the state is well ahead of the game and has been really a leader in the United States on this topic, and very much promoting U.S. participation into those events, as well as engaging with other states globally within the limits of what a state can do, because states can't have foreign policies per se. So the state is leading on the science, which is not to be understated. Understanding the impact with granularity and nuance is really important to prepare. The state is investing in infrastructure resilience and in risk mitigation. Just in the 2021-22 budget, the governor included a $4.1 billion package on climate and environmental issues. And then supporting local communities and private actors, thinking about issues around how does insurance need to evolve in a world where it might become really hard to insure certain regions in wildfire-prone areas. And of course, doing a lot through regulations that have been developed over the past 15, 20 years, since 2006, on reducing greenhouse gas emission, making sure that we have highly efficient industries, transportation sector, shifting transportations towards electrification, and making sure that our electricity is generated with clean sources.
Good, thank you. Now, back at kind of the federal level, and then broadening or widening the lens internationally, our Federal Reserve recently joined a global network of central banks, network known as the Network for Greening the Financial System, NFGSS. or NGFS, I guess it's is the acronym, which is working on climate change as a systemic risk. What are you seeing in other countries, and what can we learn from those efforts?
Sure, and make no mistake, it may sound like a local chapter of the Sierra Club, the Network for Greening the Financial System, but these are all the central banks from every country around the world. Pretty much there's over 60 financial regulators putting their heads together to figure out what are the regulations that need to be put in place to manage and try to understand and reduce climate risk across the financial system, what can be asked of banks and financial players, given the state of the research on climate and on economic impacts, and preparing to roll out regulation that has the largest banks in the world scratching their head as to how they're going to do that. And so the type of regulations that they're looking at, and certainly we're seeing the Bank of England, Banque de France, so Steve will be in agreement here. The French and the English are both in the lead. The Dutch, but also the Chinese Central Bank, Japanese Financial Authority, the Australians, the Malaysians, Hong Kong, Singapore, Mexico, and most recently the Fed finally joining the party, preparing to roll out regulation that requires banks to perform stress testing. So to start looking at how their ability to manage their financial obligations might be affected by the impacts of climate change, as well as integrating climate into the entire risk management processes for the banking system, starting from credit origination all the way to understanding credit risk across portfolios and at the strategic asset allocation level.
Right, good. So for those of us that are operating businesses, trying to wrap our minds around the risks associated with climate change can be quite challenging, to say the least. And this comes from a guy who barely passed high school biology, so it's not the easiest topic for me. But we have uncertainty with how and when climate change will manifest. That's an unknown. And then there's additional uncertainty with the economic implications, the fallout from those changes. So you have uncertainty layered on an uncertainty. The central bank group that you talked about has a strong focus, I believe, on scenario analysis, sensitivity analysis. Can you talk a little bit about that sensitivity analysis and how businesses might be able to use it?
Sure, and I think you said it very well, right? We have uncertainty layered over uncertainty. I'm going to add what is probably one of the biggest uncertainties, which is what are we humans going to do about the future of the planet, right? We've had the past 4 years, I guess, with a sharp move away from any action on climate change. New majority comes in, new president, we are reinvesting in climate change. What happens in 4, 8, 12 years? Is this going to keep going back and forth? What happens in other countries? We've seen very important countries, India or Australia, go through the same kind of back and forth. And so this policy uncertainty creates a lot of economic and financial uncertainty, especially when we think about transition risk. Are we going to be in a world where we are going to get a clear signal that we need to decarbonize the economy, and with sufficient time ahead, companies can plan and start investing and redirecting their energy and their resources towards those new technologies and those new needs? Or are we going to continue in a world where things might change in the next election? We don't know. There's no incentive to invest in the long run and hit a wall at some point where we have to urgently stop emitting greenhouse gases. And that is a scenario that's called the disorderly transition, where we do too little, too late, too fast. And it may be hard to imagine, but I think we've had a very vivid example of what it looks like. If you think about what happened last spring and even what is still happening, where the airline industry, just overnight, we stopped flying, right? And still now we're well below levels of flying that were taking place before. That's an example of not the right way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. right? Very suddenly, very violently, it's very disruptive, and big impacts on the credit and the financial health of the companies in that sector. Whereas if you think of, well, we think we're going to keep flying, we're going to invest in technologies that allow us to fly without emitting greenhouse gas, and we're going to figure that out in the next 20 years, that is not quite as disruptive. It can really be a driver of growth. So the scenario analysis exercise is really trying to, because there's so many layers of uncertainty, trying to come up with a few narratives where we tell a story of how those different things might fall together. And then we look at what that means from an economic and financial standpoint. And what the NGFS is doing, the central banks, is that they're trying to promote a standard set of scenarios that makes it easier for regulators to understand what happens in a given scenario to the entire system, makes it easier for banks who are regulated maybe in 3 different regions to only comply with one set of scenario, and it helps understand the interdependencies. It has a little bit of a risk because it means if those scenarios are not representative of the future, we may all be collectively blindsided, right? So there is a need, and that takes us to the other part of your question for local, what can you do as a business? What does this mean? It's important to try to comply and see what happens under the scenarios, but it's also important to start thinking about, what's an extreme risk? What's the worst thing that could happen to my business? And that might not be captured in those big macro scenarios, but understanding the worst case for a business based on local conditions, based on the sectors and the region that you're most involved in, is then what's going to help you plan and become more resilient to a wide range of outcomes.
And I know this is an area of deep expertise for you guys. It's a lot of the value you bring is with the modeling and the scenario analysis, and it's highly complex. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but I am curious, what kind of time horizon should we be looking at when we do that modeling? Because you can get very different scenarios if you're looking at 3 to 5 years versus 50 to 100 years, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest challenge is using current climate science. You see those most critical impacts in terms of physical climate risk looking further out, 2030, 2050. That is beyond the planning horizon for most of us, not everybody, but for most of us. And so that makes it hard to factor into business horizon decisions. However, that the uncertainty that you mentioned earlier on when and how those impacts are going to take place tends to be a little tilted towards things are worse than we think. They're happening faster and sooner than what was in the models from climate scientists a few years back. And so one of the exercises that the central banks are doing is asking businesses to look further out and say, imagine that those impacts that are planned for 2050 happen tomorrow. Then what happens to you, right? As a way to just make it more concrete and again, helping look at some of the more extreme cases.
So thank you. And we've got a question here. Closer to home, the city of Petaluma recently voted to ban the creation of gas stations to be able to be built in the city. So no more gas stations built in the city of Petaluma. Is this setting the stage for the rest of California to completely do away with fossil fuel?
That's a great question. I'm not sure the whole state is ready to do that because we need to have vehicles that run on something else than gas first, which is a work in progress. I know there's a lot of investment on this topic, and I think we will see electric vehicles really become the norm quite fast over the coming decade or so. And so I guess Petaluma is a little ahead of the game, but it's also able to do that because people can go fill up their tank in the next city over, right? So there needs to be a coordinated effort across the state and beyond because transportations are a networked infrastructure. You have to have those efforts coordinated.
Okay. Now, we have another question here, which is really around, one of the challenges that we have, where we have this tremendous amount of renewable generation from sun and wind, but it comes at certain times of the day, and they're not necessarily synced up with the peak usage times. Can you talk about the role that storage is going to play going forward, as well as the need for fossil fuels or something other than renewables to fill the gap when we do have these timing differences?
Sure. And I'll start by a disclaimer to say I'm not an expert on this. My expertise is much more on the physical risk. And I want to disclaim that because my husband is an expert. So in case he's listening, just want to make it clear. So my understanding of this space is that, we're seeing a lot of technology development in the storage space. That's really exciting. And that we're probably going to be in a position to store energy, I think, in the future in ways that we really weren't before, and that will help address some of that disconnect that we're seeing. The other thing is, I know there's been a lot of discussion, and the state works closely with all the other states that are on the Western grid to make sure that there is balancing across the grid, because it might be that California has too much solar in the middle of the afternoon, and it can send that up to maybe the Pacific Northwest. And then later in the day, you start getting hydro, or you may have wind blowing in Idaho at night, right? And so there can be balancing across the entire grid through this kind of coordination and cooperation.
Okay, thank you. So a question I'm particularly interested, which is, what are you seeing from banks in terms of the implications of climate change for how they manage risk, and in particular credit decisions that they're making? Is it part of the fabric of their decision making at this point?
Not yet is the honest answer. It's early stage, but it's evolving. I think we're seeing different things. First, I will say the very large banks, especially those that operate internationally and may be regulated in England or in Japan, tend to be ahead of the game because they have to, and because they have much more resources to put into thinking about those issues. They have a lot of investor pressure to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing. We are absolutely seeing also some local thought leaders, and River City Bank, I think, is one of them, in starting that process of thinking about how existing data and tools can help factor in those risks. And I think where we're going long term, but it's good to start thinking about it now, and long term might not be so far out if the Fed starts rolling out requirements. But I think we're going to be in a world down the road where banks increasingly consider climate risk in the loan origination process. So there might be questions in a loan application about how certain risks are managed. There might be an assessment, just the way you have a credit score based on certain characteristics. There might be an assessment of your climate risk profile, and that could factor into the credit risk assessment. This is the type of modeling that Moody's Analytics, our parent company, performs, and very much trying to create models to help banks do that the right way. And so being aware that this is what the future holds, ties to my presentation earlier, which is it's important for businesses to start thinking about that, not only in terms of managing the risk, but also in terms of access to capital, and demonstrating that you are ready, that you are prepared, because that will become a big differentiator potentially down the road in terms of also just credit rates.
And do you, just kind of a follow-on question to that, do you, and this is more of a political question, I think, but do you think it's possible or likely that banks may be incentivized to provide financing for clean energy activities through the Community Reinvestment Act, as we're incentivized to do other types of investment and lending and services?
I would not be surprised if we saw this kind of mechanisms put in place. I think there's been a few pilot programs here and there that have stayed smaller in scale, but that have helped maybe reduce interest rate on home mortgages when the home can demonstrate that it meets certain energy efficiency requirements. In other regions, in Europe, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development ran a pilot program where they provided capital for local banks to loan to adaptation technology specifically, so things that would help businesses implement water efficiency measures, irrigation, early warning alerts when there were extreme weather event risk, etc. So there's a wide range of things that could be deployed where the US is not in front ahead of the curve. There's a lot of things happening in other countries and a lot of good learning. There's learning that's happened in California as well with the PACE program, the property assessed loans for energy efficiency. So I think there's a lot of tools that exist that could help really scale up and make sure that not only we're better prepared, but also that we're able to seize the opportunities and meet the market needs to fund these investments.
Yeah. We've got a question here that's more around social justice, I think, and I'll paraphrase, but there's been a lot of discussion that while climate change has impacted all of us already and will continue to do so, it's going to have and it has had a disproportionate impact on people in low income areas. How do folks in those communities, how do we ensure that they're participating, their voices being heard in the conversations around climate change?
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up, and I meant to mention it earlier. So it is one of the big priorities of the Biden administration, and the priorities include climate and racial justice, but they also merge together into priorities around racial and environmental justice. And so the choices that were made in terms of nominations of who's been put in charge of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, of a number of those programs was very much influenced by the fact that the administration wants to make sure that this that racial justice is an integral part of these programs. And California has, over the year, really increased the effort and the focus on integrating communities, vulnerable communities as well, and environmental justice into its policymaking program that was very contentious for a long time, and I think things have been evolving over time. And then for professionals who work on adaptation, there are resources that are very much focused around equity and community involvement and making sure that all the voices are heard. I will say we published a couple of blogs on these topics back last summer on my company's website, 427mt.com. If you look it up, you'll find we include a number of resources and best practices on how to incorporate racial justice into adaptation in particular.
Thank you. Emilie, is there anything that we haven't covered already that you've got on your mind and you'd like to share with the group? Or?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I think the one thing that I want to re-emphasize a little bit is it's easy to talk gloom and doom when we talk about climate change, but it's important to remember, and I think a number of you are in the business of clean energy, so you know that already, but change brings new needs, change brings opportunity. There is a need in the market for new technology, for new financial products that will help and support this transition to different technology for energy, for adaptation, for flood prevention. And so it's important to look at that and be a positive part of the change as well, and try not to be too depressed by the bad news on the science and the physical impacts.
Well, I want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. We have a lot of people who are doing wonderful things to improve the environment, and I thank them for everything they're doing there. And most importantly, Emilie, I want to thank you for the fine work that you're doing with the company that you started and now with Moody's, And thanks for providing a really fascinating window into your work and how climate change is impacting all of us going forward. So thank you very much, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Steve, for having me.